Hi, this is Brandon from Arabian Armory. Today I'm going to be talking about katanas. This is my bonus video to make up for not being quite on time with the Viking content I'll be providing. That will come later, but definitely want to get that done for the winter because it is starting to look quite a lot like Skyrim out there for the people that are experiencing snow. Before we get to the subject, shout out to Josh Brownie. He is our Patreon supporter. If you want to support more content like this, go to Patreon, donate as much as you comfortably can. And yeah, let's get to it. So, this is also intended for people that maybe they've seen a katana at an anime convention, they're curious about it, but they don't want to get ripped off. And honestly, most people that buy katanas at anime cons aren't getting a good deal. Uh, First and foremost, what is the difference between a display katana and a real katana? And so, when you take it out of the scabbard, what you might notice is so this is a real one. First thing is how thick the spine is. Traditional katanas have a very thick spine, and the reason for that is it supports the structure of the blade when you deliver cuts and thrusts so that it doesn't flex out. You obviously don't want your blade flopping like a wet spaghetti noodle when you're fighting. And the next thing that you'll notice between a real and a fake katana is how wide it is. The width on this one is, what is that, more than an inch, maybe an inch and a quarter, something like that. Inch and yeah, a quarter. This would be not even a full inch on a display katana. They're ridiculously narrow going this way, on top of being skinny on the spine. Both of those factors combined also affect the weight. You definitely can feel the weight of a real katana versus a goofy display one. And then you look at the blade, and there's not always, but there should be usually a hamon line. Now, this wavy pattern that you see along the edge there, the way that that's created is the blade is originally forged in a straight line. And you put a clay or mud on the spine and along the flats of the blade, but you don't put it on the edge. Uh, Sometimes swordsmiths will put small sections of the clay going towards the edge in intervals of maybe an inch and a half or 2 inches. But the purpose of this is the edge, you want that to be hardened, whereas the core and spine remain a little bit softer. And the advantage of that is that the core and spine can absorb some of the impact from when you're striking something, whereas the edge is hard enough that it cuts through. Um, the hamon line is not required for it to be a good sword, however. Instead of doing that traditional multi-layer method I've described, where it's almost an iron core and then a low carbon spine, a mid carbon jacket, a high carbon edge, what you can also do is do a monosteel construction where it's all the same homogeneous type of steel. In examples like that, 5160 is a very good example of steel. 6150 is also a good steel. You can get away with 1095. 1095 is what I call old reliable. 1095 is not as expensive nor as high performing as other steels. It'll cut very great. Differences are how long it will hold the edge that you give it compared to a more expensive steel, and then to some degree also corrosion resistance. Now, if you make a steel out of one homogeneous, or if you make a sword out of one homogeneous type of steel, and then you spring temper it, the advantage is that if you have a hard lateral impact, that blade will flex and then it'll bounce back straight. Versus a traditional forging method for katanas, if the blade is impacted laterally and it hits too hard, the high carbon edge will not want to bend, but the low carbon spine wants to bend. And so what you get is eventually it will bend and it'll be sideways and you'll have a crooked boomerang for a sword. Certainly that's not effective in any kind of duel because your opponent's not going to sit still and let you straighten out your blade. Um, but yeah, a katana doesn't need to have a hamon line. If it doesn't have one because it's spring tempered, that's perfectly fine. Although be aware, you can simulate a hamon line using differences in how you polish the artificial hamon line versus the flats of the blade. So yeah. Going further down here on the guard section, so the guard and its fittings around it on a real katana are supposed to be very tight. They're very precise tolerances. This one doesn't have any wiggle room. I can slap it, I can almost punch it, and it's staying still. If that has any wiggle room, that's immediately a red flag. Similarly, if when looking this way, you see how I can't even fit a fingernail into this brass fitting, versus right here I can, because that's where the fuller is, but that's very tightly fitted around the dimensions of the blade. So that's a very good sign for a good katana. Going down into the handle section, The budget option for your handle wrap is going to be nylon. A slightly, and I mean slightly more expensive option is cotton. You can get artificial silk, that's definitely an option, and then real silk is the most expensive. I would say that there's not really a point to getting real silk. Artificial silk is perfectly fine if you want that traditional appearance and feel. Um, Ultimately, I'm also fine with cotton and nylon. The point is that it does this wrap give me a good enough grip when I'm holding the sword. All of them, yes. I mean, I would argue nylon and cotton are actually better than silk because silk is too smooth. And then on the inside, the lamination of the handle underneath the wrap is supposed to be in a traditional katana ray skin, like stingrays and shark rays, or manta rays. What am I saying? Shark rays. Shark is a related species, but yes. So the ray skin or shark skin on the inside, that is waterproof because it is from a sea creature, obviously, and so the sweat from your hands is going to not um, screw up your grip because of that material. Another thing, though, is that the handle on a good katana is oblong. What you notice is that it's narrow this way, but it's wide this way, and this allows me to index where the edge is on the blade. I can feel it. I can definitely feel if I'm holding this way. This is wrong. This is this is perfect. Um, don't ever get a katana with a broomstick handle. A round broomstick handle is great for a broomstick. It's not ever what I would recommend for a sword. There are other swords from other cultures that have a round handle, but I don't recommend it. And that's not really a thing you see traditionally. So that's another red flag if you ever look at a katana and you're curious about is this real or not. Going into the construction, there's a bamboo peg here, and under this there's another bamboo peg. So these two bamboo pegs are what secure the tang. Now, be mindful that one, katanas are not full tang really ever. They're not. Two, they don't need to be. And so what you get with the tang, right? If a sword is a welded tang, a rat tail tang, that's typically awful. That will almost certainly break. A half tang is also pretty bad. Katanas are actually something like 3/4 tang. So the steel that is the blade, that blade steel continues right about here, and then that last 2.5, 3 inches of the handle, it's just wood. And that's perfectly fine because katanas have relatively short blades for something that's intended to be two-handed. If you compare this to a medieval arming sword, an arming sword will have an almost identical length of tang for this length of blade. And so structurally that's perfectly fine, and I've never heard of any katana breaking here because of that. Enough steel is where your hands are placed that it's going to hold together. And then if you look at the butt cap and the guard, a really interesting thing that you can see in a lot of katanas that are trying to be historical replicas is the transition of Japanese culture. So Shinto spiritualism is something that comes traditionally in Japan, whereas Buddhism is something that came outside of Japan from China, and then China actually got it from India. So what you'll see is in older katanas, you'll have yokai, which is, if you try to translate that in English, like spirit beings. That's sometimes a decorative employed in the butt cap and in the guard. Versus later on, when Buddhism comes, you start seeing Buddhist motifs like the depiction of a bodhisattva or certain kanji, I believe that's the word for kanji, for Buddhist principles like the eightfold path and the Four Noble Truths. I'm pretty sure those are the principles. But you'll have references to those, right? And I think that's very fascinating for katanas because it's a representation of the evolving culture of a country. But yeah, those are just some key ways to tell a good katana from a display katana. Now, what separates good from great? It's a very good question. A great katana performs very well. It has very tight fittings. It looks great. And so, what you want to know, and these are competition cutters, that's what I'm going to be selling, is how fine of an edge are you getting out of the box? Because sharpening a blade is very time consuming. It's especially difficult because the blade has a curve. In a straight blade, you can just take that sharpening stone back and forth. But for this one, you have to carefully match the angle of the curve. So, taking this piece of paper, and yeah, it just very, very nice. I'm just kind of pulling it, and it wants to cut. Amazing. So competition cutters like this are really good for cutting tatami mats. Tatami mats, by the way, are not equivalent to cutting a human body. That's just silly nonsense. It might be closer, not ideal, but closer to compare cutting a tatami mat that has a bamboo core to cutting someone's arm off. What you will notice is if you look at Kenjutsu instructors and when they do their black belt testing for their students, what they won't have is they won't have one tatami mat. What they often do is they have 3, 5, or 7, however many tatami mats. Some schools, what they do is the tatami mats, the number is based on like what degree of black belt you're going for. As a brief aside, the color code system for belts is not traditional in Japanese martial arts. It has not been a thing for centuries. It's actually a very modern invention created to unify the practices of multiple dojos. So if a student comes from one dojo, moves to a new neighborhood, goes to another dojo, they're all on the same page of where exactly that student is as far as their skill level and what knowledge they're meant to have. But back to the point. What you'll see is there's some videos I've seen of this old grandmaster who's maybe 5 feet tall. He's in his late 60s or early 70s, and he takes a katana, he unsheaths it, he performs a cut. He cuts through all 7 tatami mats in one clean swing. And there's no rough edges, there's no realigns where it gets squiggly. And what that's showing is that he's not twisting his wrist in any weird way, he's not wobbling his elbow, he's not cocking his shoulder incorrectly. Everything is precise and exact, and that's what you want to test when you're cutting tatami mats. And so if you're going for a sword that lets you know exactly what your skill level is, what I'm marketing to you is what you're going to want to go for. Certainly there are other swords in a higher budget range that are going to be better for other purposes. If your goal is to do constant abuse tests and torture tests, you're probably going to go for a tougher steel. The budget that I'm going to be selling these for is 150 a piece, or if you buy multiples, it's going to be 125 a piece. I might do a once a month $99 deal for the first person to buy Katana that month. Not really sure, but I'm leaning towards why the hell not. But yeah, the difference between this katana and a katana that's maybe $300, the one is the steel. So more expensive steels are like 5160 or 6150. Both of those are very nice high carbon steel. They take a very good spring temper if you want to spring temper it. And the budget line is the 10 series, like 1095. 1095 I like to call old reliable. It's very good at hardening and spring tempering, but the more expensive steels will hold their edge a little bit longer, or they'll be tougher against more aggressive material. So certainly the cutting competition swords are not horrible. These are very sharp, these are very durable, they're not going to break on you, they're not going to bend sideways as long as you're using correct form. But that is one of the biggest differences. The other differences are going to go into the things I mentioned before on, does it have a very simplistic guard, or is the guard elaborate, depicting like a Shinto temple of some kind, or does it have depictions of a yokai on the butt cap, yokai being like a Japanese word for supernatural beings, you know? Or does the scabbard have some kind of fine inscription going from where the tip is all the way down to the knot here? Like, there's very decorative things that are going to be different about a $300 katana. As for performance, mostly that's coming into how long does it hold an edge, and does it hold up to you trying to abuse it. Yeah, and then a lot of times there's katanas that are on sale for many thousands of dollars. As far as what a blacksmith's time is worth, that is not something that I can say for other smiths. That is a very complicated question, and it goes into the difficulties of handmade material and handmade products. But the difference, I'm going to be real with you, between a sword that's $5,000 versus a sword that's $1,000 is very, very minimal, if at all. They could both be made out of the same steel. They could both be made with the same hardness when the spring temper. They could both be the same length, the same balance point. Really the big difference is one of them is going to be from an individual blacksmith and the other might be from some kind of brand that has multiple smiths working together to just mass produce these swords. So, yeah, hopefully this has been informative. And again, shout out to Josh Brownie, our Patreon supporter. If you'd like to learn more about swords and support us on Patreon. Thanks and have a good night.